This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen begins today's show by discussing liability for guests on farms and the importance of agreements in direct beef sales and custom arrangements. A conversation about Roughleaf Dogwood and Sericea Lespedeza and smooth Sumac with Walt Fick, K-State rangeland management specialist, continues the show. He explains how to recognize the plants and how to manage them. Finishing the show is the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weaber review what producers need to keep in mind when putting yearling bulls out for breeding. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with an agricultural law update with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us again.
Oh, my pleasure, Shelby. Good to be with you.
Starting the show, I know that a lot of people have guests come out to their farming operations, and there are some liability concerns with that. And so what are some of those concerns for producers?
Yeah, that's right. Farmers, particularly in the past couple of decades, agritourism has picked up, and we've got a lot of types of agritourism activities on the farm that are used by farmers and ranchers to generate additional income. And so it's a nice new revenue stream that some farmers and ranchers find pretty profitable for themselves. And there are various laws that govern liability issues, so we're not really focusing on those today, but there are recreational use statutes that can apply to that provides greater liability protection. But anytime we have third parties, whether they're guests or not, come on the premises and they get injured somehow, then there's that potential that the landowner could be liable. And a lot of it depends on their particular status. Did we invite them to the premises? Were they an employee that's come to the premises for work? Are we benefiting somehow from them being there? Are they there to pick up milk? Are they a veterinarian that's providing a service? Are they a hunter on the premises with permission, without permission? A whole host of situations can arise where we have third parties on our premises as a farmer or a rancher.
A case that's happened that kind of touches on this is Jones versus Wright. So could you describe kind of what that case was and what that outcome also was?
Yeah, the Wrights always had a Christmas display, and it was called Wright's Lights, and this is a rural property. And they didn't charge people to come on their premises and watch the Christmas lights. You could walk around and see all the different lights. And this was down in Texas, and so we weren't worrying about snow or ice or anything like that in December. It was cool, but we didn't have the weather conditions that we would have in Kansas or places north. And this family came. They brought their young children, their minor children with them, and they parked on the Farm to Market Road, which is a rural road in Texas. They parked on the opposite side of the road from the landowner's property and came in on the property and looked at the lights. And then as they left, all of them made it across except one of the minor children. And as the minor child was crossing the road, there was a pickup truck that started down the road without its headlights on that ran over the child, resulting in a death of the child. The landowner gets sued out of this. The family sues them based on various theories, negligence as well as strict liability. And the issue, of course, was whether and to the extent the landowners that had the Christmas light display would be liable for these guests that were on their premises that were injured. In this instance, a child was killed as they were leaving.
And so definitely a sadder scenario there happening, but important to talk about. And what was the outcome? What did that case end up doing?
Well, the landowners won the case, and so they were not responsible for the death of the child. But it really turns on the facts of the case, and this is what people need to realize. Each of these cases, when negligence is involved or liability to a third-party entrant is involved, will turn on the facts of that particular case. Here the court said they didn't charge a fee for the lights, for looking at the lights. The vehicle that struck the child was being driven at night without lights. There hadn't been any similar prior accidents on the road. The landowners used loudspeakers to tell visitors not to park on the opposite side of the road. In fact, the local police department had put up signs telling people not to park on the opposite side of the road, but people continued to do so. And the court said, well, the accident occurred off the premises. They were on the public road after leaving the rural property. And the court said, when we look at all of those facts together, the landowners didn't breach any duty that was owed to the family. So without a breach of a duty, because there was no duty, then there's no liability. And so the child's death was not a foreseeable risk of looking at the lights as far as the landowners were concerned. So they weren't responsible.
A large combination of different factors coming into that, I feel like. And so for producers who maybe aren't putting up Christmas lights but are having guests come to their operation, what are some things that they need to think about maybe before inviting those guests or even opening up their operation to people?
Well, one factor that's important, and this is, we get a break on this by the recreational use statute in Kansas. They say we weren't going to major on that, but there's one point out of that I want to make, and that is that here the landowners in Texas didn't charge a fee, and the court pointed that out. So they weren't profiting from people coming in and looking at the lights. If you have an activity where you're inviting guests to your premises and you do benefit economically from it, that can increase your liability potential. Now, not in Kansas, because the Kansas statute says that a rural landowner, a farmer, or a rancher can still charge a fee for recreational activities on the farm. Now, this would be a recreational activity, looking at Christmas lights. So that's a unique aspect of the Kansas law. But the fact that this occurred off the premises, based on all these other factors, was also in the landowner's favor. Now, for farmers and ranchers that are inviting people to the farm, say for a hayride, or maybe you've got a corn maze, or you've got a U-picket operation, something like that, you always want to have a good comprehensive liability insurance policy in place that makes sure that it covers the risks that you're wanting coverage against. Now, your general farm comprehensive liability policy will only cover risks associated with the farming activity. So you need an additional rider to cover these non-farm activity risks. That's an important point. You just don't think that your general comprehensive farm liability policy will cover these other activities that you're having people on the premises for. Talk with your insurance professional, probably get an additional rider to that policy to cover non-business pursuits of the insured. That's the key language that you want to look for. That's a good place to start. But anytime you have guests to the premises, that increases your potential for liability, and that's kind of the overall theme that people need to remember.
And another thing, talking about customers and consumers coming to operations or dealing with operations, direct beef sales and custom agreements. Also an important thing to a lot of farming operations. And so why is it producers make sure that they have all their ducks in a row for when they're in that part of their farming operation?
Yeah, that's right, because the law treats the producer differently when the live animal is sold to the buyer compared to if the sale of processed beef is what is sold. Now, if you want to buy beef directly from a cattle producer, what the law does is treat that transaction differently, depending on whether you're selling a live animal or not. And then the matter turns on whether the animal owner is the end consumer. And that's the key point. If the cattle producer sells processed beef to the buyer, well, then we have a bunch of rules that come into play with respect to the processing of that beef. The animal that's processed, the processing of it has to occur in an inspected facility. The producer is also subject to licensing and labeling and insurance requirements. But if the producer sells the live animal to the buyer, then it becomes the buyer's animal, and the buyer can do what they want in terms of having that meat eventually processed. That allows the producer then to do the processing if the buyer wants the producer to do it, because it's the buyer's animal. It's not the producer's animal. And then the farmer can sell any remaining beef not initially purchased to another buyer. So that means that we need to control that purchase arrangement by contract and clearly state that it is the live animal that's being sold and the percentage of the live animal that's being sold, not the processed meat.
And so having things wrote down and specifically showing what things are happening are very important in this scenario?
Absolutely. If you're selling the specific animal, that animal needs to be identified, the calculation of the price needs to be detailed, how you're going to make payment, that needs to be specified. Plus any processing fees should be set forth, as well as making sure that the purchase agreement is clear that the meat can't be resold or donated. And make sure to clearly state when the animal is the buyer's property. When does title, so to speak, transfer to the buyer? But the key point is that the owner of the animal and the consumer of the beef have to be the same person. So make sure, I think the take-home out of this one is make absolutely sure if you're going to do this that you have a good custom harvest agreement so that you can use that custom exempt processing option that's in the law.
And we're mentioning beef a lot here, but is this applied to a lot of the different livestock species?
You're right. That's a good point because I focus primarily on beef because that's where we see the vast majority of these types of arrangements rise. But it could be with other types of food products and other types of animals also. Same principles would apply.
So, Roger, if people are coming to your farm to look at it or buying product from your operation, what are the key things that you want producers to do and think through before they let those different options happen?
Yeah, well, I think it's good that we tied both of these topics together in one program because anytime you have people coming to your premises, particularly for a business purpose, which means you are benefiting economically from it, you have to realize the heightened potential for your liability risk. And then if they're buying a meat product such as beef products, make sure you've got a contract that says they're buying the animal, if they want to buy direct from you, rather than the processed beef. Those 2 points are good to discuss together.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and giving us some more information on some agricultural scenarios.
Thank you, Shelby. My pleasure.
That was Kansas State University and Washburn Law Professor Roger McEowen as he discussed liability for guests on the farm and direct beef sales and custom agreements. If you would like to read more on these topics, you can do so by going to his blog, which will be linked in today's show notes, or you can find it by going to washburnlaw.edu/Walter. Again, that is washburnlaw.edu/Walter. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and we're continuing today's conversation as we talk about weeds and shrubs. And in to talk about it is K-State Rangeland Management Specialist Walt Fick. Walt, thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be with you.
And Walt, starting off the conversation here today, roughleaf dogwood, what is it?
A roughleaf dogwood is a woody plant, so it's a shrub, although it can get to be fairly large. I've seen them 10 feet tall, but generally grows in multi-stem clumps and 5 to 10 feet tall. And it's pretty scattered throughout the state. It's a major one here, of course, in the Flint Hills area. It's blooming right now, and that's a good sign in terms of timing, of at least if we're going to use herbicides to control it. But it can take over, with where we burn regularly, we keep a lot of these woody plants off, including the roughleaf dogwood. But if you cut back on your burning frequency, roughleaf dogwood is one that comes in fairly quickly, and once established, then it's hard to control just with fire, and that's why we generally then start talking about use of herbicides and managing it.
And where are people most likely to find this?
Well, it grows on a lot of different soil types. I don't know that it's limited to any certain one. Prefers, I know, a lot of times it's on the slopes rather than maybe on, get real shallow, rocky soils. You might find a little dogwood, but mostly I'd say on the slopes be a common place to see it.
If they find it and they're seeing it, what are some control methods? Because you mentioned burning, but that's not a solve-all problem. Yeah,
it's burning is, these plants, in order to control them with fire, they need to be leafed out in the spring. And dogwood generally doesn't do that. It's generally the latter part of May, so it gets pretty difficult to burn at that particular time. One option that might be that with some of these woody plants at least is that a growing season burn is something that people are starting to look at. And by that I mean, let's say mid-August. And you might be able to control dogwood better that time of the year with fire than maybe in the spring.
And are there some chemical uses that could be done for roughleaf dogwood?
Yes, like I say, this is right at their prime time for trying to control it when it's blooming. And, some of our common herbicides that we've used for a lot of things, like 2,4-D, for instance, been around for a long time, won't do anything to roughleaf dogwood, so we have to use some other chemistry. Probably the best one is using a mixture of 3 herbicides. I guess I'll use the chemical names, but if we use picloram and then triclopyr and 2,4-D in a mixture. That's about as good as we can do on terms of dogwood. There are some other chemicals that can work, but that's probably among the best. If we talk about actual rate, I would probably use, let's say, 2 pints of 2,4-D, a pint of Tordon 22K, and a pint then of Remedy Ultra, for instance, as a 3-way mix. And actually that'll control many woody plants, but that's probably about the best treatment on roughleaf dogwood.
And another plant we're going to talk about is Sericea Lespedeza, and it's actually a noxious weed. And so more than it just being a noxious weed, what is it?
Sericea Lespedeza, it's been a problem for a number of years here in Kansas. It was actually put on a county option noxious weed list as early as I think it was 1988. But it's a statewide noxious weed at this point in time, meaning there's some regulation involved with people needing to control it. It's actually a legume, which, when it first grows and starts growing, it looks like it'd be a nice palatable plant. It's high protein. But the problem with it is that, at least for cattle grazing, Sericea Lespedeza contains a condensed tannin that ties up the protein, making it indigestible to cattle. So they don't tend to eat it during most of the year. Thus, if it's not getting grazing pressure, then it's probably going to increase on our grasslands. I think it occupies 65 to 70 counties. It's been found in the state of Kansas. The last estimates I've seen were about 465,000 acres infested. So it's one of our major noxious weeds in the state of Kansas.
So in over half the counties in Kansas, what does it look like?
Well, it's like I say, it's a legume. It's kind of like clovers in that it's typically will have 3 leaflets. It's a compound leaf with 3 leaflets. What helps us identify it, compared to some other similar species, is the shape of those leaflets. Most people are probably familiar with white or red clover, for instance, and they're almost round leaflets, at least oval shaped. And Sericea Lespedeza is longer than it is wide, but the leaflets themselves are wedge shaped, or we say club shaped. They're wider toward the tip than they are at the base of the leaf. And when it's not blooming, at least, that really helps us differentiate it from similar species. Now, Sericea is an introduced species. It was not native to North America, but we do have a very similar-looking native Lespedeza called Virginia or slender Lespedeza, and I've seen them grow side by side, but we distinguish between those based on that leaf shape.
Where are producers or people most likely to find this? Is there a certain area they like the most?
It's pretty indiscriminatory in terms of where it tends to grow. I've seen it on very shallow sites as well as on the deeper soils. Probably be more productive, on a deep soil, deep rich soil, but it occurs across the landscape, and it is a major problem through the Flint Hills area and like I say, about half of the state.
Noxious weed obviously has some management and needs to be taken care of, and so how can people do that?
Well, there's some options. One of the things we've discovered over time is that when here in the Flint Hills we do use prescribed burning a great deal. Well, fire in, let's say, April, early May even, will not damage Sericea Lespedeza, but fire will stimulate seed germination. And thus, those seedlings are actually easier to control, with a follow-up treatment than, let's say, a plant that's, it's a perennial plant that grows back year to year. And so, if you have a significant amount of Sericea, I usually recommend people go ahead and burn that year, turn around, you wait, maybe a month or so, and then you spray it, because that way you'll get those new seedlings that are coming up as well. Some evidence now, of course, that burning in that growing season burn I mentioned for some of the brush, say mid-August or during the month of August, for instance, we've seen that burning at that time of the year will actually eliminate seed production on Sericea, even though it's a perennial, meaning it comes back from its root system each year. It primarily spreads by seed. So if we can eliminate seed production, that can be beneficial in the long run. The problem is being able to do that. As you think about when things are nice and green, it's a little more difficult to burn during the summertime, but it can be done with proper planning. Like I say, it reduces the seed production primarily.
And one more plant to talk about, another shrub, smooth sumac. What is that one?
Yeah, smooth sumac, and it's probably heading out, I think, right now as well, and susceptible to herbicides. Again, with fire will not do much for us. Let's say at least a spring fire. In fact, you probably stimulate it more than anything. You may keep it short, but it have more stems than you started with. It also tends to grow in colonies. It's got kind of a waxy green leaf. Probably people would really notice it more driving down the roadsides in late summer because the leaves turn red. So it's really obvious, that time of the year. But right now it's putting on that seed head, and it kind of looks like people are familiar with grain sorghum or milo. It kind of looks like an open milo head. So, and that again, that's the signal for us. That's the time to treat it with a herbicide. Smooth sumac is probably among our easier plants to control. 2,4-D, 2 to 3 pints per acre. 2,4-D at that time will do an excellent job on smooth sumac.
And is this something producers could be finding in their pastures, or is it really just along the roadside?
Well, it occurs on the pastures now. It's a native plant, and its natural habitat is probably in those rocky, shallow soils. And I don't get too concerned about it if it stays there. But what tends to happen is it will spread out onto deeper, more productive soils without control, and then I think it's going to be a good thing to try to set it back, because again, it'll form a canopy, shades out the ground, and so you'll start reducing grass production underneath it if that happens.
Continuing to talk about the shrubs, the roughleaf dogwood and the smooth sumac, something that cattle aren't more than likely going to eat. However, maybe sheep and goats?
That's correct. Woody plants, cattle will eat certain woody plants, but these are two that they probably aren't going to browse much at all on. But yeah, goats in particular would probably be the animal of choice if one wanted to get some grazing use on dogwood or sumac.
Walt, if people want to learn more about the roughleaf dogwood or the smooth sumac or the Sericea Lespedeza, how could they do so?
Well, you can find lots of information, of course, online, and of course we've continued to publish information about them in our agronomy e-updates. So, we've got some pictures present there. They can see the items. But there's a number of publications on woody plants of Kansas, for instance, that those species are discussed.
That was Kansas State University rangeland management specialist Walt Fick as he discussed roughleaf dogwood, Sericea Lespedeza, and smooth sumac. The Agronomy e-Update articles that contain information about each of these plants can be found in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Kansas State University's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts as they discuss yearling bulls. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue the show with K-State's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts.
Hi, welcome to BCI Ask the Experts. I'm Brad White. Happy to have two experts with me today. In fact, two Bobs. Good morning, Dr. Bob Larson.
Morning, Dr. Bob Weaver.
So we've got you guys on because we've got a good question relative to yearling bulls. And for each of their answers, they'll get up to 10 points. So the question today is, I just purchased a relatively expensive yearling bull, preparing to turn him out with my herd. What are your tips to making sure we have a successful year with this bull? Bob, I'm going to go to you first.
I think recognize, and I like that you led with that he's relatively expensive. And even if he wasn't, this is an investment not only for this year, but hopefully for several years. So I'm going to say one of the main things is really pay attention to them. This is not a proven bull in your operation. And so make sure all things about health, so body condition score, feet and legs, soundness, all the types of things that can cause a bull to have problems, health problems and structural problems. Monitor that pretty closely. He's young, and he's getting to know his way around your operation.
Excellent. 5 points for Bob to start. Bob?
Yeah, I'm going to say turnout duration. So yearling bulls tend to kind of run themselves a little bit ragged, and we can control that by maybe not leaving them out for the entire breeding season if you have a structured one, or certainly if you have a much longer breeding season, don't leave the bull out with the cows.
Okay. Excellent. And what are you thinking as far as number of days there?
So I'm thinking, yearling bull, if you've got, and to Dr. Larson's point, he's unproven, right? So we want to manage both herd risk, a bunch of open cows because young bull doesn't know what to do. So turning out multiple bulls, but maybe not at the same time. So kind of control, so social dominant stuff. So I'm going to say half of the breeding season for turnout on a yearling bull, and certainly the ability to capture and put him somewhere else is an important consideration here.
Okay, so excellent. So 5 points for Bob as well. Working on the assumption that this bull had a breeding soundness exam. He was fertile before he went in. But Bob, I'm going to ask you, what are some of the things I should watch for during the breeding season, specifically related to his ability to breed?
One of the main things to watch is feet and legs. In that foot rot, just injury, anything that affects his mobility is going to affect his ability to follow the cows and breed them, but also then it negatively impacts sperm production as well. And so those are really important. So feet and legs, movement. A lot of times what that means is on a scheduled, so don't just say in general, I'm going to watch the bulls. Put it on your schedule every 3 days or every 2 days. Get out, make sure that he's up, walking, watch him walk, make sure that he's healthy in that way. Other things like body condition and things like that are really important. They tend to change so slowly that the only reason body condition would really drop is if he's really in trouble. And so watch that, but you may not see anything until it's pretty severe.
Okay, excellent. So some good things to watch. And Bob, I'll let you if there's anything else you want to add to watch. But I also want to ask you, what bull to cow ratio should I choose? And I'm going to make this bull imaginary. He's 15 months old.
Yeah, so I like the kind of the rule of thumb is 1 cow per month of age at turnout. So if he's 15 when you turn him out, he can cover 15 cows for a 45 to 90 day breeding season.
Anything else you would watch for?
Well, and I'd say if you're planning on using, if you're a 2-season calver, if you're planning on using him in the fall, that extra recovery time in between is also very, very important. Make sure he gets body condition score recuperated. He's still trying to grow, so maybe get him in, put some feed to him, make sure he's in good shape for turnout for fall calvers.
Excellent. So I like both those, and you guys have really led into all the things that we want to watch, including the frequency that we want to watch that bull. Any other tips for managing these yearlings as you adjust them into the environment?
The one other thing that I think is important is this a one-bull pasture or a multi-bull pasture? Because in a single bull pasture, one thing I can really monitor the amount of mating going on, kind of, and his health. If it's a multi-bull pasture, another concern arises, which is injury due to bullfighting and things like that. And so, again, not only monitoring the individual bull, but the group. Are we having problems with aggression and those types of things, in which case we need to change the population. We need to move some bulls in or out if it's a multi-bull pasture and we're having problems.
Absolutely. Great thing to watch there. Appreciate you guys joining us. Good yearling bull tips. Bob finished with 8 and Bob finished with 7. So thank you guys for joining. If you have questions, send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, that was the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weber. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.